they have awareness raising activities, they've done internal surveys on what their awareness is within research staff. And they're bringing a lot of that together in interesting portals. So if you look at things like the Lincoln Orbital or the things that Southampton or Oxford, for example, have in place, then there are great resources. But that doesn't mean necessarily that researchers are going to adopt and jump on board research data management, even if they're aware of the problem and given training. I think the key, at least when we talk to a lot of institutions, is doing research data management in a way that immediately benefits or makes the benefits clear to the researchers who create the data. So showing them examples or case studies of how making data accessible means that their publications will be more cited, they'll get more downloads, people will contact them, and there's more chance of research collaboration, and good data management plans can actually increase the chance of successful funding. So I think there's a lot to be done still in terms of building a strong case to show researchers why they should do research data management. And there's also the need to make the infrastructure really easy to use. And I'll probably come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
So these are just a few examples of tangible benefits that I took from some work by Jonathan Tedds at Leicester, from Bristol and Datadog Breers, some examples that we've seen on storage cost savings, and generally quantifying the benefits. And if you can quantify the benefits, then I think you can make a really good case to researchers of why they should get involved. And that really, helps get the whole ball rolling.
Okay. You just noticed we jumped from 1 to 3, and there's a good reason for that, which we'll explain in a second. So coming back to policies and procedures, one of the things that again stuck out for me from the interview we did with Kevin, actually at the DCC, is sort of a general split between going for an aspirational policy versus a mandatory policy. So Edinburgh is a good example for aspirational policy, where they're saying we will try and do this, we aim to do this. So it's a bit more sort of forward-looking. Other policies are more mandatory, prescriptive, you have to do X, Y, and Z. There's good reasons for both, and good reasons and arguments why you have one or the other. And I think the three mentioned there, Edinburgh, Oxford, and Hertfordshire, we've got some links later on which we're going to share, but they published their policies, and we think they're a good way to kind of start and just get a feel for what other people are doing. Tim's going to talk to you a bit about IR stats and measurements and why that is important for policies.
Yes, well, the guidelines are sort of explicitly say that you need to retain the research data for 10 years from the last time that it was accessed. So unless you have a way of recording when your various bits of research data are accessed, then it's going to be very difficult to be able to decide which data can be retired effectively. So what we've done at ULCC is we're putting together an ePrints-based data repository platform, and one of the key components of that platform is the IR Stats software package, which was developed for ePrint, which allows institutions to visualize and understand the way that the assets in their repository are being used. There are a number of examples of institutions that use the reports generated by IR Stats to inform their internal management decisions. So a good example is our colleagues over the road at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who regularly use the IR Stats reports to help them understand what's going on with their publications repository and where perhaps they need to put additional resources if a particular topic has become popular and they want to make sure that they're adding as many research papers on that topic as they can, for example, and also looking at how the various schools and departments are using the repository and where they need to perhaps target or focus training activities. So yeah, so IR-Stats is one of the key components of the data repository package that we've been putting together. And I think this probably takes us on to the next slide quite nicely.
Should do, yeah, there you go.
Because this slide is just listing some of the other components of our data repository package. So our data repository package is completely open source. So what we've done is we've built a data repository platform using ePrints and using a number of different plugins which we think are essential for supporting the RDM process. We've made that package available on GitHub. And what we're doing at ULCC is taking that package and providing a hosted and supported solution. So just some of the plugins that are included in that package. So we have the Repo-link plugin. Now this is relating to the EPSRC guidelines on metadata. Now the EPSRC guidelines are not very specific when it comes to describing which metadata schema you want to use. So the approach that we've taken is to use the Repo-link plugin. So this was developed by University of Essex. It's a GIST-funded project. And what that project did was to come up with an initial community consensus as to what a metadata schema for describing research data should look like. So effectively, you drop this plugin into an ePrints repository, and it replaces all the research publication specific metadata with metadata fields that are more geared towards capturing metadata about research data. Okay, so it's although the EPSRC guidelines are, aren't particularly clear on what metadata you should be capturing, it seems like a good, sensible starting point to use the Repo-link metadata schema. In terms of accessing the research data, we also use the collections plugin. This is a plugin that gives you the ability to aggregate individual bits of research data into collections or projects. So it's another way of enhancing the discoverability of your research data. It's another way of providing another entry point for researchers who are looking at your data repository and looking to understand how the various bits of research data fit together. Okay. Another part of the EPSRC guidelines refers to being able to access the research data via a permanent link, a DOI. So we've included the DataCite plugin, which was developed at Southampton. We've included that in our repository platform. And what that's going to do is automatically mint DOIs for each research data file that is uploaded into ePrints. It's not only going to mint the DOI, but it's also then going to check and verify that that DOI is active and working for you. Okay. And finally, on this list, we have a Repo-link plugin. Now, this is a plugin developed by my colleague Rory McNichol here at ULCC, and it was developed in conjunction with the University of East London. And what they wanted to do was to be able to link the research data records in their research data repository to publication records in their publications repository. So what Rory has come up with is a little tool that when you're depositing a research publication, it will allow you to link that publication to the underlying data sets from which it was derived, and vice versa. When depositing a research data file, it will allow you to link that back to the publications which it informs. Okay,
that's good. We had a question here from Richard about what about institutions using pure and DSpace?
I'll pick up on that briefly in a minute.
Okay.
In a general case, but yes, I mean the same challenges apply to anyone using a CRIS or institutional repository of how to deal with the data and the metadata.
Okay.
Yeah, so at ULCC, what we've chosen to do is use ePrint as the basis for our data repository solution.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if that answered your question, Richard, but maybe if Matthew comes back to it later.
Yeah, I'll come back to
if
it.
not, let us know.
Yeah, if I forget.
We've still got it flagged up. Matthew's going to say a bit more about metadata.
Yeah, so the EPSRC expectations are quite interesting. They don't say exactly what metadata is required, but they are quite clear about its purpose of being able to find and then be able to use the underlying data. And that, of course, leads to the need for DOIs. And that means the metadata and the data are connected, both in terms of their purpose and how they're linked. And of course, they live in a variety of different systems. So on the ground, having to build an infrastructure to support research data management, people will typically have one or more of a CRIS system, an institutional repository or a data asset register, public repositories for putting data into, private repositories or data vaults. And this slide I've taken from Edinburgh in a blog post they made about a year or so ago. And if you, on top of this, you can overlay. So if you can overlay all the different solutions or pieces of the puzzle. And that includes Pure and DSpace, but a range of CRIS systems and institutional repositories. And then comes the question of how they all get linked together. And I think you probably have to hit, there we go, there. Oops, we've gone.
Yeah.
So this is what we see at Arkivum in practice going to talk to different institutions, that they have different models for where their data goes, where their metadata goes, how they get linked together, how that gets connected out to DOI minting. And it can end up being particularly complicated, hard to manage, and crucially, very hard for the researchers to use. So if you come and ask a researcher, well, you've got to put your publication here in a journal, you've got to put your data set here in a repository, and you've got to make a copy of that data set in the internal archive, and you've got to make a copy of the publication in our institutional repository, and you've got to report the work you've done into the CRIS system, then it becomes a bit of a nightmare. So what we're seeing is people particularly interested in how to simplify that from a researcher perspective, how to make that infrastructure really, really easy to use. And this comes back to the point I made earlier about trying to make things beneficial to the researcher, not just in terms of making their data easy to find and citable and downloadable, but making the system that they need to use easy for them to put their data and metadata into. Oh, that doesn't look great, does it? Where have all the
stripped out?
So some of the, I don't know what you guys are seeing, but we're not seeing quite what should be on this slide. There's some blue boxes missing in between the arrows. This is an example of Loughborough. It's where they've got symplectic elements as their CRIS system. They've got DSpace as their institutional repository. They have Arkivum as long-term storage. But in terms of what their researchers use, they recognize that a lot of their researchers already use Figshare as a simple way of getting data out there and being used. So what they're going to be doing is using Figshare as the interface to pretty much everything. So there's just one place that their researchers go, deposit the data and the metadata, and then Figshare feeds it into the institutional repository and into archival storage. Figshare mints the DOIs and gets the metadata and the DOIs back into the CRIS system, which means everything happens behind the scenes and automatically from a researcher point of view, and they get to use tools that are familiar to them. And this is a common theme that we're starting to see across institutions as they start to build out real research data management infrastructure, of how to make it easy to use from a researcher point of view.
So we've got another example here
Yeah.
without the boxes.
Do you want to have a go at talking about something with no boxes on it, Tim?
Yes. So this is what we've done here, is just put together a similar diagram which tries to illustrate the setup that we have at ULCC at the moment for our hosted and supported data repository service. So effectively, the academic on the left there turns up at the ePrint interface with their data and metadata. ePrints via the data site plugin will go away and mint and verify a DOI. Then the data, the metadata, and the DOI will go into the, what did that box say, Frank? ePrint ULCC storage.
Yes.
Yep.
I think it did.
So it effectively goes onto our network, and from there the data goes into we have an Arkivum appliance in our data center. So from the local ePrint storage, the data will be transferred onto our local Arkivum appliance, and then on into the Arkivum network. And the ePrints web interface, which is the empty box on the right, is going to provide the searching and the browsing and the access to the data via the collections plugin.
Okay. I see Richard seemed to have similar experiences with boxes on distributed slides. So Microsoft got the better of us, I guess. But hopefully, you know what we try to illustrate. We had a question from Niam. Integrate. Neve, is it? Is that? Oh, do apologize. Integrating things as much as possible for the research is fantastic. Has anyone managed to also link up with ResearchFish to facilitate reporting of research outcomes? Do we know about that?
Not us yet, but that is an interesting thought. I mean, I think, for example, JISC and their program for looking at how they're going to fund the next generation research data management work. I think that sounds like a great thing to incorporate into some of the ideas.
So I was sort of peripherally involved in some work at Southampton, which was pulling in data from Gateway to Research, which is a sort of a similar system to ResearchFish. And also we looked at how ePrint could actually submit outputs to the research outcome system, which is now defunct, I believe, the RC UK research outcome system. So hopefully we can take some of that experience forward to integrating our particular setup with ResearchFish as well.
Okay. We had another question in the chat about which Chris at Loughborough.
So that was symplectic elements. So they've got elements, DSpace, Arkivum, and Figshare. And of course, Figshare and elements are from digital science, so they already talk to each other.
Okay, that's good. We move on from that. You wanted to say something about strategy.
I think this just says what we
just
really been talking about it. Yeah, that one of the keys to research data management is make it easy for researchers, and that then helps make a clear and simple case to the EPSRC. So we're seeing a Arkivum, for example, with the Loughborough study, that Loughborough can go to the EPSRC and say, hey, look, our researchers are using Figshare, which means they've got metadata about the data. It's up there, it's easy for people to find. The data itself is in Arkivum, so it's going to be there for the long term and is safe. DOIs are minted automatically, and there's a really easy route for people to request and access the data. So in one sort of go, they can say, look, we've got everything in place to meet the requirements.
Okay. We had another question more in the chat though. At which stage in a research project do you ask researchers to submit data? When grant ends, earlier, or does the PI submit for RAs?
So that's going to depend. I mean, the expectations are certainly that any data that supports a publication, for example, can be used to verify the results of research published in a publication, should be made accessible. And those publications could be during the project or at the end of the project. There are also EPSRC expectations on data that doesn't come with a publication, that if it's created within a project, then there's a time window within which, from the date of generation of the data, that you need to make the metadata available and the data accessible. So I think that's under expectation 5, and the EPSRC are relatively clear on their requirements there, that they've got a set of cases about data and metadata and publications, and a set of sort of time windows within related to data generation or the end of a research project, and when that has to be made accessible.
So that the EPSRC are fairly clear on the time windows, but as to how each individual institution builds those time windows into their research project process is probably going to vary.
That's a matter of internal policy, probably.
Yes.
I think there's a general theme, I think, for me, that the EPSRC are relatively clear on what they want to achieve, but they're not prescriptive at all on how it can be done. And indeed, they expect a lot of variation between institutions on how they meet the requirements. I was talking to Ben Ryan about this a bit before Christmas, and he's quite happy to see different institutions do things different ways, provided the overall expectations are met. And he's quite interested to see what different solutions arise. And as they arise, that's when there will be more standardization, I think, on the best way to do it.
So perhaps in the first instance, the thing to do would be to look at your existing sort of research project process and identify where you could slot in activities around filing the data.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think my personal feeling is that that should be, even if the data is not made immediately accessible, then the data should be captured absolutely as soon as possible. So trying to do research data management as close as possible to the point of creation of the data is the best thing to do, because that's when you're most likely to be able to get a hold of the metadata to say what that data is. You're going to get time out of the researchers to put that effort in to describe it and do that initial curation. So a policy that tries to, at least internally with an institution, get hold of the data and the metadata as soon as possible makes sense to me.
We had another question in the normal chat. Is there a recollect equivalent for DSpace, or even better, one which conforms with Reox? Looking at Tim.
Yes, well, you're looking at the Reox expert. Is there a recollect equivalent for DSpace? I don't know, I'm afraid, but I know the man to ask, so I can find out. Or even better, one which conforms to Reox. So I was one of the developers who developed the Reox plugin for ePrints, and I think the Reox specification is quite clear that the Reox application profile is for research publications rather than research data. So I will be sort of keeping a close eye on that and talking to people like Paul Walk to find out whether the longer term strategy is to extend Reox to also be able to describe research data, or whether a new separate application profile would need to be put forward to do the Reox equivalent for research data.
Okay. We had another question from Richard about concerning uploading large file sizes. So he talks about
Yeah, I think
in the terabytes.
we're going to mention the research data screen, which I think ties in with that question. So perhaps we can come back to that.
Yeah, we can. And then another one from Richard, who's very busy today, is about what needs to be available on the 1st of May. Is it a catalog? Is it all the data? Do we know?
There, I think the expectations are reasonably clear. It's the metadata that says what the data is and how to access it that has to be made available and online, so the data is easily discoverable. But the underlying data itself doesn't have to be all online. It's okay to have a system where you publish the existence of a data set and then provide a mechanism for people to request access to that data set. And that could be by redirecting them to an institutional repository and getting them to fill in something that asks them to identify themselves and justify why they want access to that data. And it's okay to provide them with access to that data in a timely manner, but that could be, several days later, whilst the data is retrieved from an archive and put somewhere where they can easily access it. I think there is a big difference between the metadata being instantly accessible and online and really easy to find and use, and the data, which doesn't have to necessarily be that way.
So part of the metadata would be to capture exactly how and what steps you need to go through in order to access the underlying data.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so a DOI might resolve to a landing page that details that, or the metadata itself might describe the process for accessing the data.
Okay. So moving on to the sort of longer term aspect of the EPSRC requirements, which is probably something Matthew can tell us a bit more about.
Yeah, so next slide, I think.
Yeah. Oh, you didn't like that one.
So there are a couple of aspects to preservation. I mean, preservation in the general sense of ensuring that data is usable over time. So that includes things like ongoing curation and file format migrations and digital preservation in general. But then there's also, I think, what the EPSRC are generally interested about in this particular expectation is about that the data is going to be kept somewhere safely and securely. So if it does have value, if it is requested to be used, then it can be retrieved and delivered to the people who want it. And there, I think it's an issue of finding solutions for the data that allow you to store potentially large amounts of data at low cost, with a really good confidence that that data is going to retain its integrity and its authenticity and its accessibility. And it is accessible, but it doesn't have to be instant. So you can satisfy those access requests in a timely way, but not necessarily have to put everything online at great expense.
Okay, we had another Reox related question.
I think Sheridan was, when I said I knew who to ask about DSpace and Reox, Sheridan was the person I was going to ask, and he's very kindly put some information there into the public chat.
There you go. That. Okay. Moving on to our so Matthew already mentioned the data curation a couple of times previously, and I'm just going to put up a quote from Kevin, which he sort of provided as part of the interview we did, which I think highlights quite nicely the sort of need to think about it even before the research project kicks off, or as it kicks off, because it would help you identify what you have to do when and at what stage in the project. They also have a nice, I don't want to say slide, but a graphic that nicely illustrates how it works. We can share that after the webinar, which I found quite useful. are we getting? So we did the funding bit. We were planning to have another poll, but seeing that we already showed you this slide, that kind of defeats the purpose of it. So Matthew already talked about that one and the various percentages of research funds, which was from an Oxford study.
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of brings us to any more questions you might have.
Were we going to come back to that one about large files?
Large files. Well, actually, we can. Let me go to the next slide so we can tell you a bit about that. If you want to talk about your idea.
Yes. Okay. So this is related to the question about issues around getting large files into storage. Now, in our current setup at ULCC, when you upload a file into the ePrints repository, that file effectively goes through ePrints, i.e. it gets uploaded to the ePrint server, it then gets copied to the Arkivum client via a CIFS mount, and from there it goes on into the Arkivum network. And once the data file has gone to green status, i.e. its data integrity is guaranteed, then we can delete it from the local file system. Now, however, if the archival storage isn't handily next door in the data center and mountable, then that poses a bit of a problem. If the archive storage is remote, then ideally what we want to do is be able to still provide that single point of deposit, but not send the large data file through ePrints. So ideally we want to avoid using HTTP at all, because it's not a great protocol for transferring large amounts of data. So we want to look to tools like, is it BBFTP?
Yeah, there's several grid FTP,
Yeah.
or there's various tools for.
So there are, yeah, but they're kind of quite low level as well, aren't they? So there are some tools out there, specialist tools for transferring large files that don't use the normal HTTP protocol. So as part of this JISC data spin idea, we want to look at those. We want to look at how we can provide a single point of deposit, but not have to send the data file, particularly if it's a very large one, to and fro between ePrints and the data storage in order to get it safely stored. We'd like to send the data one way and then the metadata the other way.
I think that's an example of a general problem that things like Pure or CRIS systems have evolved now to starting to support data, but don't have a background in that area, so they struggle with large data files. Likewise, ePrints and DSpace and other institutional repositories have grown up supporting publications, and now they're evolving to support data, and it's showing their limitations too. There's a general challenge of how to deal with data sets and then link them into CRIS or institutional repository systems. And if you look on the research data spring, there's an idea in that general area posted by Edinburgh and Manchester around the general concept of a data vault and how to link it into the rest of the RDM infrastructure. So that will be trying to tackle that very problem.
Okay.
There's a question about costs at the end. About
this one here.
Yeah, sharing costs around data. The thing I'd suggest there is people have a look at the curation cost exchange from the 4C project. It's in its very early days, but it provides a platform for institutions, organizations to share cost information on curation and preservation. And we know some higher education institutions are already starting to put some cost data into there. So you can go in, you can sign up, you can put your costs in, and then you can compare what your costs are with other people's costs.
Just putting a link out there. Bear with me.
Yep, that's the one.
Yep. I hope it was. Okay, so we had some others. I see a few people are typing, so I'll let you finish your points in the chat and not cut you off. Just so you're aware, sort of next steps. So as I mentioned earlier, we've recorded this webinar, so we're hopefully going to make it available in the next 48 hours. So that will be on our YouTube channel, and you can watch that and share that. We will get back to you some point next week, Monday, Tuesday, I reckon. Just sort of summarize some of the links to resources we mentioned today and refer to recording of the webinar. We don't have any outstanding FAQs at the moment, but if there's anything else you can think of, then we can put it in. And Richard just asked tools for uploading large files. We have a look. If we find anything we can put in, then we will include that. What do we have here, Joe? Thanks for mentioning. Okay, yeah, Joy, happy to mention Curation Cost Exchange. We can include that in the follow-up email and then just sort of make a bit of a splash about that and get people to contribute to that, because obviously everybody benefits. What do we have here? Just total cost, ownership. Yeah, that's a good point, Jason, I think.
Yes, UK data repository, I think, is a really, really interesting idea, especially for EPSRC, where they don't support a repository for a lot of the data that's generated in their projects, unlike, you know, the UK Data Archive for social sciences or NERC data centers. So a national service would be very interesting.
Okay, what else? Joy, thanks, you're welcome. Shared service, I mentioned earlier. Can't say it otherwise. Thanks for the kind words. We have one question from Quentin, which we can.
So the question is, if we get ULCC to host, how would we do the large file upload? So the answer to that is, at the moment, you should be able to get files up to sort of several gig in size uploaded over the web in the normal way. If you've got some huge files, as of right now, the best thing to do would be to get them to us on tape, and we would just upload them directly into our archive and appliance in our data center. The longer term answer is to keep an eye on that GIST data spring idea that we were talking about just now, because this is aiming to resolve exactly this issue.
Okay, I'm just typing a response, sorry. Someone keep talking.
Yeah, in context of shared services, I think that a shared service could be done at the local level between a local set of universities. It could be done at a national level. I think what's needed is some of the tools to help build those shared services, tools that are already sort of connected together. So it's easier to build shared services and deploy them without having to go through a whole load of integration hassles between all those components that I showed on the diagram earlier with circles. So we've got a research data spring idea in that area as well.
Okay, perfect. So we up to 55 minutes. I think.
Thanks. This question in the Q&A there. Is that a question? Can you expand it?
Yeah, right. Hold on. Move. Can we answer that one?
Yeah, I think so. It's just thinking how to summarize the question. So Sheldon has asked about uploading a set of data files that are associated with one another, including the key contextual information necessary to enable reuse and the ability to reproduce experimental results. So in terms of the systems that we've been discussing, so obviously I can talk about the data repository platform that ULCC have developed. So what I would see happening here is either uploading a set of data files to the same record in your data repository and then using the metadata on that record to describe how they're related to one another and how they're derived from one another, or using the collections plugin, so you can upload the data files as individual records in their own right, then use the collections plugin to bring them together, and at the collection level, use the metadata to provide some context about how those data files are related and derived from one another.
Yeah. Just getting back, I hope that answered it. I think it was more of a statement than a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, if that's all, then
I'd only have one final thing, is that there is a event in London at the end of next week on research data management readiness, organised by the DCC, with Ben Ryan from the EPSRC and JISC there as well. I think that it's already fully subscribed, but it might be possible that there will be recordings or other ways of getting hold of the information from the session. So we'll post the URL to that as well.
yeah.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for your time. We kept your time particularly well, I have to say. Thanks to my two colleagues, Matthew and Timothy, for their time and expertise. And if you have any questions once we hung up and finished, or anything else comes to mind, do get in touch and we'll try and answer them. Oh yeah, so Joy just said slides and will be available from their event as well, so that's good. Okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
We all done?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.